Thus far in our series on the greatest chapters in the Bible, we have looked at Genesis chapter 1, which begins with those wonderful words, "In the beginning, God." And we know that that chapter goes on to tell us about how our wonderful Creator brought everything into existence by the power of His Word, climaxing with the creation of man in His own image. Then last Sunday night we looked at Genesis chapter 3, which tells us how God's great and wonderful creation became marred with sin. And that chapter introduces us to Satan, who is the source of all sin and all of this world's woes. And so tonight our study brings us to Genesis chapter 22. This great chapter has sometimes been described as holy ground because it's here that we are given a foreshadow of God's sacrifice of His only begotten Son, Jesus Christ. And because we got a lot of ground to cover tonight, I want to just go right ahead and get into the message. First of all, in this wonderful chapter, we are told of a great saint. Look at verse 1. Genesis chapter 22. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." You know, the Old Testament introduces us to many great men of faith, such as Joseph, and Daniel, and Moses, and Elijah, and many others. But at the very top of that list of great men of faith stands a man by the name of Abraham. The name Abraham means father of a multitude. And if you and I were to trace our spiritual roots all the way back to its origin, those roots would lead us right to this man named Abraham. Now, Abraham's story actually begins with God's call to him back in Genesis chapter 12, 10 chapters earlier than where we are tonight. And at that time, his name was Abram, which meant exalted father. Listen to God's call to him in Genesis 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. God said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Now, although this promise may have seemed a bit far-fetched to Abram because he was 75 years old, and his wife Sarai was 65 years old at that time, and they had never been able to have any children, Abram still obeyed what the Lord had commanded him to do. He packed up all of his belongings, and he and Sarai and his nephew Lot and all of his servants left their home in Ur of the Chaldees and began their journey of faith to that land that God would show them. Moving on to Genesis chapter 15. God appeared to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward." But Abram said, "Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" Well, in that 15th chapter, God goes on to tell Abram that Eliezer was not going to be his heir. God promised Abram a son who would provide him with countless number of descendants that would be so numerous they'd be like the stars of the heavens. Moving on to Genesis 16, we read about that account where Abram and Sarai took matters into their own hands. When Sarai had Abram father a child through her handmaiden, Hagar. And once Hagar gave birth to Ishmael, Sarai became deeply bitter and resentful and jealous towards Hagar, and she had Abram send her away along with her newborn son Ishmael. Moving on to Genesis 17. God made a covenant with Abram, reaffirming his promise to bless him with a son, and Abram responded by falling down in laughter. Moving on to Genesis 18, God changed Abram's name to Abraham and changed Sarai's name to Sarah. Genesis 19 tells us about the destruction of those wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom, of course, being the city where Abraham's nephew Lot and his family had settled when they moved into the land of Canaan. Genesis 20 tells us about Abraham's shameful behavior at Gerar, where he and Sarah concocted a lie about her being his sister instead of being his wife, so Abimelech would not have him killed. And then when we get to Genesis 21, God fulfilled the promise that he had given to Abraham 25 years earlier, when God blessed Abraham and Sarah with their very first child. And we know that they named him Isaac. Isaac means laughter. Abraham was now 100 years old, and Sarah was 90. And so now in our text this evening in Genesis 22, we meet Abraham, this great saint of God, in what would become the most defining moment of his earthly life. That brings us to our second thought, and that is in Genesis 22, we are told of a great sacrifice. Let's read verses 1 through 5. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. After waiting their whole adult lives to have a child, God now commands Abraham to do the unthinkable. I want you to pay real close attention to how specifically God spells out his command. Verse 2. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now let's think about something. Did Abraham not have anything else that God would accept or that God could require of him? He would gladly have given God all of his flocks of sheep. He would have gladly handed over all of his gold and silver. If it was a human sacrifice that God wanted, why not require the life of Eliezer, the one that Abraham originally planned to leave all his inheritance to? Or why didn't God require the life of Ishmael, the son that Abraham had fathered through Hagar, Sarah's handmaid? But God required of Abraham the life of his son, his only son, the son whom he loved. God required the best that Abraham had to offer. He required the most precious thing of all to Abraham. And you know, it almost seems cold and heartless that God would remind Abraham in this command just how much he loves the one that God is asking him to sacrifice. And not only was Abraham losing his beloved son, he was losing him in the most bitter and most horrible manner possible. Not by sickness, not by disease, not by accident. He had to take the life of his beloved son himself. His son would die by his own will. His son would die by his own hands. Now, how could he live with himself after this? How could he come back from Mount Moriah and tell Sarah the awful thing that he did to their son because God told him to? If he took the life of his beloved son, how could God then fulfill the promise that he made to Abraham to give him descendants as numerous as the stars of the heavens? Thoughts that must have been racing through his mind. The intense pain and heartache he must have felt. But just as he had obeyed when God had commanded him 25 years earlier to pack up all of his belongings and leave Ur of the Chaldees and go to the land that I will show you, Abraham promptly obeyed this command as well. Listen again to verses 3 through 5. Listen to the obedience. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place in which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. This is talking about Moriah. He saw it afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." There's a valuable lesson for all of us to learn here, and that is our obedience to God's commands should be prompt, without delay. That's how we demonstrate our faith in God. That's how we demonstrate our trust in God. It's not our place to question God. It's not our place to argue with God or to balk at His commands. Our duty is simply to obey, and to obey promptly. And we don't always do that, do we? In fact, we sometimes delay our obedience, or we postpone or procrastinate our obedience until a more convenient time, if we even obey at all. And I want you to notice Abraham was very careful to obey every single detail in this. He had to saddle his donkey. He had to call 2 of his servants as well as his beloved son Isaac. And he had to split the wood that would be used in the burnt offering. And then for 3 days, they journeyed to the place where God told him to go offer his son as a sacrifice. Now think about that. For 3 long days, he had to ponder what God had commanded him to do. For 3 long days, he carried this unbearable burden in his heart as they traveled to Moriah. And when they were close enough to start seeing the peaks of Moriah off in the distance, Abraham told his 2 servants, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." Did you ever wonder why Abraham told his servants to stay back? Did you ever think about that? Perhaps it was because he didn't want them to see the unspeakable thing that he was going to do to his own son. Because he knew they would try to stop him. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe it was something far greater than that. You see, maybe Abraham knew in his heart that if his 2 servants went along with him to the actual spot of the sacrifice, that it would be very easy for him to surrender the duty of sacrificing Isaac over to one of them, so that he wouldn't have to go through the pain of taking the life of his own son. And so Abraham asked them to stay back with the donkey, because he knew that this was something that he and he alone had to do. This was to be his sacrifice. This was to be the price he had to pay. And no one else could take the life of the son but the father who loved him the most. And let's not overlook the importance of what Abraham said to his servants as he and Isaac prepared to leave them. I'm sure you caught it. Remember, he said, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship. And then what? We will come back to you. He didn't say, I will come back. I mean, that's what you would think he would say here in light of what he's about to do. He didn't say, I will come back. He said, we will come back. Now, was Abraham planning to just stage Isaac's death but not really follow through with it? Absolutely not. He truly believed by faith that he and Isaac would both return. He had faith that even if God allowed him to follow through with actually taking the life of his son, that God could not lie. That his word would not fail. And that he would resurrect Isaac back to life in order to fulfill his promise. That's how much faith Abraham had. And Hebrews 11:19 in the New Living Translation says, Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, listen to this, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. So far, this great 22nd chapter of Genesis has told us of a great saint, and it has told us of a great sacrifice. And thirdly, in this great chapter, we are told of a great son. Let's move on to verses 6 through 10. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father? And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. You know, the role of Isaac in this incredible true life drama is perhaps the most overlooked part of this passage. We always focus on Abraham, but we never focus on Isaac. There are a couple of key points that I want to make about this great son of Abraham. First of all, I want you to notice in verse 6, it says, so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. Do you get what's going on here? Isaac is literally carrying upon his own back the wood upon which he will die. He's carrying the burden of death upon his own shoulders. Now, does that not bring to mind the image of Jesus carrying upon his own back the wooden cross upon which he would die? Does this not paint a portrait of Jesus himself carrying the burden of death upon his own shoulders? Isaiah 53 verse 6 says, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Now, the second thing I want you to notice about this great son, Isaac, is that phrase, the two of them went together. It's first mentioned in verse 6. Look at what it says. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife. Now here it is. And the two of them went together. Now, skip down to verse 8. And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. That phrase is mentioned twice. Now, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that Abraham and Isaac weren't just together physically. They weren't just walking together physically. They were walking together in the Spirit. They were one in the Spirit. They were of the same accord in what's going on here. Even though Isaac may not have fully understood all that was about to happen, he still follows his father. He willingly surrendered to the will of his father and ultimately to the will of the Heavenly Father. Now I want you to keep in mind that Abraham was at least 115 years old by this time. Isaac could easily have run away from him. He could easily have overpowered his father when he began to tie him up and lay him down on the altar, but he didn't. He willfully and obediently laid his life down on the altar of sacrifice, just as Christ willingly and obediently laid down his life on the cross. And in that 10th verse, we are given that dramatic image of Abraham, the loving father, holding that knife high above his head, ready to take the life of his son, his only son, the son whom he loved. Now, that brings us to the next thing this great 22nd chapter of Genesis tells us, and that is we are told of a great substitute. Let's move on to verses 11 through 14. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Get the picture here. Just as Abraham is ready to take the life of his own son, God stopped him. He stopped him. Because Abraham fully intended to take the life of his son, the sacrifice was now complete. In the eyes of God, it was as good as done, though there was not a single scratch or one drop of blood on Isaac's body. The test was now over, and Abraham had passed it with flying colors. But that's not the end of the story. Verse 13 goes on to tell us, Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. Now, do you think it was just a coincidence that there happened to be a ram caught by its horns in the thicket that day? No, it wasn't a coincidence or an accident. It was an act of God. One commentator said that it was as if when Abraham and Isaac were going up one side of the mountain to the site of the sacrifice, that the ram was already coming up the other side of the mountain. You see, God provided a substitute. God sent the ram to take the place of Isaac. And what a portrait of God's grace. God fully intended for Abraham to carry out this sacrifice. And Abraham fully intended to take the life of his beloved son. But by an act of his divine grace, God spared the life of Isaac and provided the substitute to take his place. Now I want to make a statement here, and I want you to see how this all pieces together, and maybe you've never thought of it. Abraham so loved the Lord that he gave him his only begotten son. And God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. But by his grace, God spared the life of Abraham's son. And by his grace, God did not spare his only begotten Son, but delivered him up for us all. Romans 8:32. You know, we can't study this great 22nd chapter of Genesis without being reminded of our Heavenly Father and his sacrifice of his Son, his only Son, the Son whom he loved. This wonderful 22nd chapter of Genesis teaches us many valuable lessons about faith, about trust, and about obedience. But maybe most of all, it teaches us about the importance of total surrender. If God were to command you to sacrifice the one thing that you love more than anything else in this world, what would it be? Your spouse? One of your children? One of your grandchildren? Your money? Or a particular material possession? What would it be? If God asked you to sacrifice the thing that means the most to you, what would it be? You see, we must be willing to give God what is the most precious to us. He wants more than our spare time and the leftovers of our life. He wants to be the Lord of all in our life, and only when we learn to totally surrender our all to the Lord are we truly free. All to Jesus I surrender, all to him I freely give. I will ever love and trust him, in his presence daily live. That great hymn that we sing certainly was true of Abraham. And I'm wondering tonight, is it true of you and me? Do we truly surrender all? We're going to sing our hymn of invitation this evening.